thing I'm just picking up on you saying, people saying like, well, I got punished and I turned out okay. I will say that I have met a lot of those same people. And when they start to unpack their actual lived experience and how it lives inside of them, right? Because so many people have these blinders on, just like I did. Like, maybe it wasn't that bad. It's no big deal. Like, I did turn out fine. I was a married mother, PhD, author, right? Like, on the outside, everything looked pretty good. But on the inside, if you looked in a lot of these ways at the quality of my relationships and what you're talking about right now, which Pete Walker calls emotional flashbacks, right? So this idea that I'm going to get in trouble, I'm about to get in trouble. And that's the language. It's not even that I'm going to be punished. That's too adult. Like, it feels like a kid with all this gray hair going, I'm going to get in trouble. And I knew intellectually I wasn't going to get in trouble.
Hi there, I'm Lori Petro, the founder of Teach Through Love, and this is the place where I show you how to create teachable moments with your kids. Today's episode, we're going to talk about narcissistic abuse, childhood trauma, with one of my new favorite people, actually, who I found online through another podcast, and her humor on Instagram just makes me just giggle. It's just right up it's just my kind of humor. Along with her knowledge as a clinical psychologist made me jump at the chance to invite her here, and I'm so glad that she said yes. Ingrid Clayton, PhD, is a writer and clinical psychologist and the author of Recovering Spirituality and her new memoir, Believing Me, Healing from Narcissistic Abuse and Complex Trauma, where she uncovers her personal experience of childhood trauma from a psychologist's perspective. Ingrid works with adults who want to become more conscious to improve their relationships and connect with their highest self. And everyone knows that's exactly what we do here. So I am so thrilled to welcome Dr. Ingrid Clayton. Oh, I found you.
Oh, good. Okay. Good. Yay. Oh my God. It's always this way.
It's the perfect start.
It's always this way. How are you?
I'm very good. How are you? Thank you so much for agreeing to come on and
my pleasure. Thanks
share
for
your story and your book. Your story really captured me on the Dr. Ramani on that podcast.
Okay.
That's where I heard your story.
Mm-hmm.
And it's so funny because even experiences can be completely different.
Yeah.
And yet I was like struck by how many things were the same in a completely different experience.
It blows my mind to hear that so often, because we all think that our experiences were so unique. I was like, nobody has my experience. I felt like no one would identify, and everybody says what you're saying. It just blows my mind.
It's very true. And you do think, and you want to reach like at least one person, right? That you think will identify and understand, and you'll help them feel understood. How many of us are there really out there?
I know.
I think the thing that gets me most is this, and you say it in the book, you say, I don't know if what happened actually did or if it was that big of a deal. And trauma is for people with other trauma, more severe experiences.
Yeah.
And for me, there's like this pervasive silent epidemic of hidden abuse, emotional abuse, control inside our homes, inside good homes.
Yes.
And it's sort of all of this hidden abuse that is just hidden behind this veil of suburban normalcy.
Yeah.
So can you speak to that, and how, if that was a part of, because you say on the back of your book, what if emotional abuse is so hidden, its effects remain unchallenged for decades, masquerading as personal failings? And for me, I started out on this journey trying to figure out why I was the one that was like all messed up in my family. Like, why was I so screwed up?
Yeah.
And Teach Through Love originally stood for transforming the emotional abuse of children. And that word emotional abuse, when you said that was like something that you like had never heard, I was like, oh, me too. It gave me like this language finally.
It's a thing. Yeah. Well, I heard that language as a child from a social worker because
Yes.
a friend's parent had called social services, and it was all like secretive, and I had to meet with the social worker, but I was a little bit excited, like someone's taking my life seriously, right? Like I look around and I know other people, their home life doesn't sound like my home life. I don't feel the way in their home that I feel in my home. And so someone called and I thought, okay. And she sat down, this social worker, with her very official clipboard and started asking questions. And all she wanted to know about was physical abuse. And I was like, well, no, not really. And no, not that. And what kind of this? And well, my mom has bruises sometimes, but we never see anything. And then she said, it was very brief. And then at the end, she said, well, emotional abuse isn't reportable. Like there's nothing I can intervene on. So on one side, I'm like, emotional abuse, like that's a thing. I'm like really grabbing onto that language, but right behind that was like, that's not that bad, right? There's nothing we can do there. Almost like, oh, you silly girl. Like
And a message.
yeah, I was told that there was physical abuse happening in the home, and so I'm going to pack up my things now and go. And then you fast forward decades where I'm now working as a clinician in a treatment center. Bessel van der Kolk is doing a training on trauma. And I feel like he's telling my story of a client of his, but he's talking about it with this word trauma. And I'm like, what is going, that's trauma. And then I run later to our DSM in the United States, our Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, about all of our, diagnoses and their symptoms and their criteria. And under trauma and PTSD, at the time, it said you had to have experienced a life-threatening situation, right? Even out of the gates, just to qualify. So now, once again, I'm shamed. Like, how embarrassing that I thought that my experience would sort of fit. And yet, my whole life, I'm living with these symptoms of what I now know is 100% unresolved trauma. And I'm so thankful that now we have this new lens to sort of differentiate what is acute trauma, like what we think of with veterans and people who've experienced, natural disasters and car crashes and things that are so obvious and identifiable, and even physical abuse, right? There was an event. If you ask 10 people, 10 people are going to agree, yes, that was traumatic, right? For a long time, that was really the definition of trauma. But what we now know is that with complex trauma, which complex is synonymous with developmental trauma, childhood trauma, relational trauma, it's these pervasive cuts to your psyche over and over and over and over. And that the combination of those over time equates to not only the same dysregulation in your nervous system as the acute traumatic event, but we have a few extra symptoms on top of that because it is relational. And so our relationships tend to be really problematic. We're full of shame and self-loathing. And so now we have this lens and language. But, part of my story is that after that training with Bessel van der Kolk, I went on and completed my master's degree and my PhD, and I've been working as a trauma therapist in private practice, and I'm still thinking, maybe it wasn't that bad. I mean, come on, right? It took me so long to wake up to the truth and to be able to say, this was traumatic. And guess what? We know that it's traumatic, not even so much by the events, but by how it's living in my body today.
I love this. And I'm going to try not to cry because that's the thing, right? It's inside our bodies. It's not because we can, at least the people that I know that have had childhood trauma, we can intellectualize and we can analyze, and we're probably a lot of us are really good at knowing exactly what happened to us and why it happened to us.
Yes.
But can you talk about some of those patterns that showed up for you? Like, there's so much I could talk to you about, but because I work primarily with trying to help parents and kids have good relationships, something I never had, and in a way where we don't pass on patterns of blame and shame and judgment and guilt in the ways that I received them. But that's so hard, right? Because when the parents like me and you that have experienced such chaotic relationships and disconnected relationships, and I also did not have a relationship with my mom where I had like, she disconnected from me. I didn't even have to. It was probably the best thing. I didn't even have to abandon my mom because she actually disconnected from me. But when you don't have that, it's hard to show up for our kids, right?
I mean, hard is an understatement. I think the work that you're doing is like the most important on the planet. And we need so many more conversations like this. And so I'll be really candid, right? That as I'm sort of coming to really just with my own experience, my own history, how it was still living in me, right at that time, I had a baby. I had a baby. And I thought I was going to be the best mom on the planet. I loved all my nieces and nephews. I had been a nanny for years for kids that I loved so much. It felt like they were my own. I love crafting and singing and right, like all of the things. I was like, this, I meant to do this thing. I'm a therapist, right? I have all this information. And nothing kicked my butt the way that becoming a mother did. And maybe in part because it was so unexpected. Again, because I thought like, I've broken the cycle. Here I am. I'm sober. I've been sober for decades. I grew up with like rampant alcoholism everywhere you turned. I really did feel like I had already broken so many chains that I was like setting myself up. But again, what I didn't know is that this stuff centered in my body, in my nervous system. So if my son was having a perfectly appropriate developmental response, particularly as a toddler, I was so triggered. But because I couldn't identify my story as traumatic or that I had unprocessed trauma, that language of being triggered, I couldn't even use. I just thought, why am I so frustrated and mad? And then I'm thinking, oh, it's because I'm a bad mom and I'm not using the right parenting tools. And then I go down that rabbit hole and everything becomes about what do I need to do to wrangle my son so that he behaves differently so that I'm not so triggered. But I didn't know that. I believed that it was true, that I just was genuinely a bad mom. I mean, what a horrible, vicious cycle to be locked in. You know, fortunately, as I started to get more of this language for myself, I could identify that what was happening for me was, in fact, a trigger, that no one held space for my big feelings. I mean, it made me honestly mad that I was in the position that I had to do that for someone else again, which is like, honestly, I can't even believe I'm saying it out loud right now because it's so shameful. It's so shameful because I love my son more than life itself. But this is what was happening in my body, and I could not control it. And I think this is rampant. I think this is a major epidemic. I think we don't know what we don't know, right? And I'm so grateful for all of the parenting content out there now that's literally here's what's so great about the parenting content, particularly for people with childhood trauma, is I watch a reel or I see a meme or I read something and I go, oh yeah, that's the parent that I want to be to my son. But I simultaneously get to digest it as a reparenting technique for myself.
Wow.
So I'm expanding simultaneously in both directions, right? Like this is the beauty of parenting. This is the gift of like doing the work, even though it's so hard, is I do genuinely become a safer space. I think, the kind of parent that I want to be for my son, while I simultaneously hold that kind of space for my whole history and my whole self in ways that it was never held. Like that's pretty profound.
It's huge. It's so huge. Are there favorite things that you've learn to key into or latch onto when you're in those moments when you see yourself getting triggered and you know that you want to create space for your feelings and your son's feelings? Are there things that you physically do to regulate yourself that are sort of like your go-tos?
Yeah, it's so challenging in the moment. I'm grateful that I, first of all, have a partner that knows these things about me, that sometimes the best thing I can do is I look to him and I go, I gotta tap out, right? I gotta, like, can you hold the space, please? Because I'm aware that I cannot.
Yes.
So asking for help, if it's available, I think is a pretty big one. But I think the biggest thing, and it sort of comes out of what I was starting with, which is like holding space for my son's big feelings. Like, I genuinely was looking at him through a lens of deficit, like there's something wrong with him and something wrong and I needed to fix, right? Again, because no one ever held space for me in that way. I was a problem. I needed to be fixed. I was selfish and all these things that they told me. And so just remembering that my son is perfect, that he's exactly where he's supposed to be, that there's nothing wrong here. This is not an emergency. There's no 4-alarm fire. I think the other reason that I get so triggered, and this will make me emotional, is because if I didn't do it right, I got in real trouble. And so the idea that my son, he has this big personality and he's so crazy smart and he can be big. He can be big in ways that I go, oh, he's going to get hurt. He's going to get hurt. So all these reasons I'm wanting to kind of shut it down, right? So when I can remind myself, like, it is not my job to shut it down. He's exactly who he's meant to be. And I will not look at him through a lens of deficit just because that's what my body reflexively wants to do. It enables me to do the orienting to the room in time and space, look around visually, like get my bearings, feel my feet on the floor, take a deep breath. I always put my hand on my heart. To me, this is self-compassion. So I'm trying to hold space for him, but I need to hold it within myself at the same time. It's these little things, but they go a long way as a practice, right? And so what I really want to say is I don't do these things all the time, right? Sometimes I will raise my voice and I will not be the parent that I want to be. But you know what? My son is funny now because I'll go into his room later or the next day, whatever it is, and he goes, Mom, I know what you're going to say. Like, he knows what I'm going to say because I've had to go in and repair and say, I'm so sorry that I didn't handle that the way that I would have liked, right? Like, what do you want to tell me about your experience, of what happened? And we talk it out and we reconnect and we repair. And that's the other thing I never ever got. I wanted desperately my whole life. I thought getting that repair from the outside was the thing that was going to unlock something for me as an adult, but I can unlock it for myself.
Yeah.
Which enables me to do it for my son in the moment, right? So it's like 8,000 different little things happening simultaneously. Sometimes I can catch them, sometimes I miss that boat, but I just keep showing up. Like, that's the biggest tool. Keep showing up with this intention to do it differently and grow my window of tolerance. So no matter how big my son is and becomes, I have space for all of it. Like, that's the goal.
I love it. We have a saying around here, conscious, not perfect.
Yes. Oh gosh. Yes.
Because there's no reason to even try to be perfect because, like you were saying, all of that reparenting or healing ourselves that needs to happen will happen in the repair too. It doesn't happen because we were like some perfectly emotionally attuned parent, because who the heck can do that all the time? I would like to meet them. Actually, I don't want to meet them because I cannot handle that and I can't do that. So they can stay away. But it's so much about just in those small moments. And we're teaching our kids not only just how to handle emotions, but how to handle it when we don't handle emotions well. They learn so much. You said something, and I remember reading this in your book, and it was that you were a 42-year-old who felt like you were about to be punished. I think it was maybe when and everybody has to go get the books. I'm not going to give all the spoilers, but
Oh,
I do want to touch on it. I think it might have been when your stepfather had passed away and you were coming back. And I just remember you saying, and I wrote it down because it jumped out at me that you were, of course, can't find it in my notes right now, but that you were a 42-year-old feeling like you were about to be punished, and it was because you were always punished. And
yes,
so I'm trying to always get parents to move away from punishment. It doesn't help. It doesn't do anything. It just makes kids sneakier, all the things.
yes.
But they will often say, well, I was punished and I turned out fine.
Mm.
And it's like, well, okay, maybe we're fine now, but I want to know how we were then. But can you just talk about because some of us really do have that, and I don't know if we're aware of it always, but have that feeling that we're going to get in trouble. Like our peers are going to judge us, or somebody's going to come in and tell us that we're wrong, or we are actually going to get scolded by our parents in ways that, would only happen when we were young.
Yeah.
But if we do that to children, can you just kind of share what that does to
Yeah.
a young child, to the relationship, the attachment, and just to their self-concepts?
Well, one thing I'm just picking up on you saying, people saying like, well, I got punished and I turned out okay. I will say that I have met a lot of those same people. And when they start to unpack their actual lived experience and how it lives inside of them, right? Because so many people have these blinders on, just like I did. Like maybe it wasn't that bad. It's no big deal. Like I did turn out fine. I was a married mother, PhD, author, right? Like on the outside, everything looked pretty good. But on the inside, if you looked in a lot of these ways at the quality of my relationships and what you're talking about right now, which Pete Walker calls emotional flashbacks, right? So this idea that I'm going to get in trouble, I'm about to get in trouble. And that's the language. It's not even that I'm going to be punished. That's too adult. Like it feels like a kid with all this gray hair going, I'm going to get in trouble. And I knew intellectually I wasn't going to get in trouble. I could say to a friend or a colleague, whatever the situation was, oh, I feel like I'm going to get in trouble. And they would be like, oh, Ingrid. And they would also try to unpack it from this intellectual place, right? Which is what we talk about as a top-down intervention, a cognitive, like brain-based intervention. But trauma lives in the body, in the nervous system. It's way more primitive than that. In fact, it doesn't connect with these parts of the brain that can be so smart and talk about it all day long. It just feels real. It's happening now. It's happening now. So Pete Walker calls that these emotional flashbacks. And this is one of the other reasons I thought, well, I can't have trauma or PTSD because I'd never experienced a flashback. I'd never experienced a flashback like you see in the movies where suddenly I'm back in that situation and it's right. But I experienced it like this, sitting in my office as a 42-year-old woman, whatever the thing was happening, there was a fragment of something in my life. And it could be so teeny tiny. It could be a smell. It can be a feeling in my body. It could be a word someone used. But it would bring me back to that terror of childhood where it just felt like the bottom's about to fall out. I just know it. And how do I guard against it? And I think I lived in that emotional flashback place most of the time. Most of the time. Again, we know
Even
that,
realizing it,
yeah.
like your unconscious baseline.
Exactly. But I'm sort of trying to manage it again with this like cognitive thing of like, why am I making this such a big deal? Because I know it's not a big deal. But meanwhile, my body's like on fire going, this is a big deal. And I couldn't talk myself out of the feeling, right? So that's another one of those like symptoms that legitimizes, as though we need the legitimization, but I know that a lot of us do, my experience of trauma much more than like what actually happened in my childhood. It's that I'm sitting there feeling like the bottom's about to fall out right now, terrified, just terror.
And how many people blame themselves for that feeling of just being so anxious that you're stuck or whatever your
Yes.
particular symptom or challenge is. So many of us blame ourselves for then not keeping it together, not being good enough, not being able to just do life
Yes.
when you never were really, your nervous system was not primed to handle those kinds of situations. Would you talk a little bit about your experience and what, just because I want to kind of give the arc to how you got to that healing place. And I know we kind of jumped right into all
Yeah.
the good stuff, but you you grew up with a stepfather who was a narcissistic abuser. But
Yes.
you didn't realize that when you were living
No.
in it, right? There was all that, as we
I
said
thought he was
earlier.
an a-hole. I thought that's what I knew about him. I knew he was a bully. I knew he convinced people that he was like charming, but I knew he was not. And I always knew my parents were alcoholics, both my biological parents and the partners that they married subsequently. I had that language, but I didn't understand the narcissism piece ever. I just was at the mercy of it, right? I was the scapegoat essentially. I also didn't have that language. He would give us mostly me actually, the silent treatment for weeks to months on end. I didn't exist in my home, and then one day you get all kinds of gifts and lots of attention, that sort of trauma bonding push pull intermittent reinforcement thing that is so deeply, deeply scarring and manipulative.
And the buying you gifts and taking you places and
And then
making you seem like you were the special one to only then
yes.
turn around and use it against you
And
or
knowing it can be ripped away at any moment, right? So it's sort of like you try to stay in the good graces because it feels a lot better than when you don't exist. But eventually it's going to come and the cycle just keeps repeating. And so what I also sort of knew back then is that I thought he was parading me around like a girlfriend, but that was the part where I was like, well, maybe those weren't his intentions. Like maybe that was me just in puberty, not really understand. No, he was grooming me to be his girlfriend. And I understand that now, in part from the research that I did for my book, but in part because I just believe me and I can look back and see with eyes that are very clear about what was going on, that was happening. So all of that, just deep, deep confusion
and it affected the relationship with your mom. I'm not sure if how that relationship was before, but it certainly created a large wedge there going forward when he came into the picture, which you were pretty young still, weren't you?
young. Yeah, well, I had known him my whole life because he was my dad's best friend originally. But I was like fifth grade. I forget the ages when my parents got divorced, and it was like my dad moved out and he moved in, and I don't really recall. And again, I was young, really young, but I don't really recall feeling super close with my mom before that. But I remember her absence when my stepdad came into the picture. It was truly like she'd be standing in the room, but she didn't exist. Like he answered for them. She only spoke when she heard him say the words before, so she knew that they were safe and correct. Everything was just deferred to him. And just how that one piece alone, when I think about a young girl being moved to a new place in the middle of the mountains, doesn't know anybody else, ripped away from all her friends and her family. And in her own home, her mom is just shrinking and disappearing before her eyes. Like, how terrifying.
And how the coping mechanisms that you need as a child to even
Oh,
navigate and get through. Do you think that did you shut down? What were your coping mechanisms? Because I know it led to some experiences that many of us have that are challenging in our early 20s, especially when we try to go out into the world. We think, oh, I'm going to leave all that behind.
yeah.
And then we get out into the world and we realize we don't really have many examples or many coping skills to
Yeah.
act
All
on.
I had was coping tools, right? Like coping mechanisms. I didn't have a sense of self. And so, very young, I remember I was a detective. When they were gone, which was a lot, I would go through everything. I would climb into the cupboards above the fridge and I knew where all their drugs were. And I needed to know, I needed to know, I needed to know in order to feel safe. And similarly around their alcoholism, like my eighth grade research paper, when we were writing our first research paper on any topic that we wanted, and my friends are writing about snowboarding and like making movies, the title of my paper was Alcoholism, the Family Disease, right? Like I wanted to figure it out. And you know, it's no shock that I ended up being a psychologist. It's like the roots of this path were definitely formed there, you know? But like a lot of us too, like I said, I'm never going to be an alcoholic. I'm never going to be like them. And of course, the second I got my first taste of alcohol, it was like, it quelled that feeling that I'm going to get in trouble, right? It quelled all that anxiety and that fear and that I'm losing my mother and I don't have an anchor and I don't know who I am and I don't know where I'm going. It was the only thing, in fact, drugs and alcohol, that gave me like a little lever where I didn't have to live in terror all the time. And so, yeah, I became an alcoholic. Are you kidding me? It's like there was no not having that happen. And I'm fortunate that I got sober very young. And so I was able to sort of, you know, build a different set of resources from that point on. But you know, all my relationships, I now know that I am a classic fawner, the fawning trauma response, right? That the trauma response where you're reading the room and you need to figure out what anybody needs and how do I be that? Because if I get you to like me or, you know, project what you need me to project, then I'm going to stay safe. Then I'm going to stay safe. And so this funny thing happens with fawning in particular. People who exploit need fawners. As a fawner, I learned to get a shred, a semblance of safety in self-abandonment by going, I can't fully be present to myself, but I'm going to orient to you. I'm going to do my best to see what you need. This is literally how my body found any sense of safety. So guess what my body was looking for out in the world? To be exploited. It's what I knew. It's what was familiar. Like we say that in the trauma space all the time. It's like you may have this head full of information about what you think you're going to do. Same thing with parenting, right? I thought I was going to be but then there's what's living in my body, the only experience I'd ever had. Of course, that's what's going to like rise up when I'm put to the test. And so all my relationships, romantically in particular, were just horrendous. Like if you were actively addicted, if you were unavailable, if you gave me breadcrumbs, I was like, how do I be your girlfriend? Like let's make it happen, you know? And it happened over and over. And I didn't know why.
In an effort to keep safe. Is that what you're saying? If I'm hearing
Yes.
clearly, because it was what you knew, what you knew to do
Yes.
to stay safe.
And alongside that was always the fantasy in childhood. And then I carried it into every future relationship, which was, and you're going to see that I'm worth it any minute now. And then you're going to be available. And then you're going to stop drinking. And then you're going to be nice to me, right? It's like that toxic hope, I called it in the book, that so the setup is that familiar, you know, chaotic sort of, oh yeah, I know how to navigate this environment. But it's always with the hope, you know, it makes sense, right? I don't just jump into the chaos going, whoopee, this is what I always wanted. I jump in because it's familiar, it's where my skills are, but I'm always going, it's going to change any minute now, right? How do I make this change? What else do I need to do? How else can I shapeshift? If I go into this kind of a pretzel, or then you're going to change. And I couldn't stop. And I sat on so many therapist couches. I talked about this thing inside and out. I had so much insight, but it never changed what was happening in my body. And that is why we need to understand trauma.
Do you use somatic therapies? Do you recommend that? I mean, I know that is, we have to get into our bodies, right? So what do you recommend for people? Because I know so many people, either they don't want therapy, they don't believe in therapy, or they've gone to therapy and it hasn't done anything.
Exactly. Yes.
We have to get back present and comfortable. We're always trying to, I know for me, it was like just escape that body feeling. And just like what you were saying with alcohol, what do you recommend then when we have intellectualized all our emotions and we know our stories and we can talk about it, but we're still...
Generally speaking, I mean, and there are so many different modalities and more popping up all the time. And I think it needs to be trauma informed at the like least barrier of entry. Trauma trained is better. Like trauma informed means I have a general working knowledge of trauma, but I think a trauma training in particular, if it were me and I'm looking for a therapist, I want to know they have at least 2 different trauma modalities, because we know every nervous system is going to respond differently. I'll use the same tool for 5 different clients, and 2 of them are like, this is miraculous, and 3 of them are like, meh, didn't do anything for me. So I use somatic experiencing and EMDR in my practice, but as a client, I'm doing it more as a therapist, but as a client, my therapist is a sensory motor therapist and an internal family systems IFS therapist. And I think it's just important to ask the questions, right? I feel like we don't even think we can be educated consumers with therapists. We're like, oh no, they're just supposed to know, right? They're a therapist, so they're just supposed to know. I mean, I never knew that as a client coming up in my teens and 20s. I just thought, oh, you're the therapist, you're the expert, so I'm going to come to you. And, I went to therapists that were classically sort of psychoanalytically trained, and they were this blank slate. They only answered all my questions with a question. And it made me, so dysregulated, so anxious. Here I am. I have no sense of self. No one's ever mirrored anything back to me. And you're answering all my questions with a question. But what did I walk away from that with? Oh, now I must be really broken. There must be something really wrong with me, right? So I also think if you have relational therapy, you need a relational therapist, someone who's not going to ask you a bunch of questions. They're going to say, this is what I think about that. They're going to let you know, now this is my opinion, but it doesn't mean that I'm the expert on your life. I'm just going to offer it up and we can walk around it together. Like, I think for relational trauma, that factor alone, regardless of modality, is key.
Yes, thank you for sharing that. I think it's just important to share that it's not, you just don't just go, like you said, don't just go to any therapist. Like, look for someone who's trauma trained, who has a few different experiences in this, because we just can't go and talk about it.
No.
You talk about it being pre-verbal.
Yeah.
Trauma is, like you say, in the body, and it's pre-verbal. So it's not about, what do you mean by that? It's not about the language then.
To articulate it, you're using a different part of the brain than where the trauma is actually stored, right? So we're much more interested, like as a trauma therapist, I don't say, tell me what you think about that. Right? I say, what are you noticing now? What are you experiencing now? We're constantly bringing back down into the body, and it could be, people might not even know what they're feeling, but they can notice sensation. They might notice a tightness or like a, and we build from there. Yeah, it's just 2 different mechanisms. It's 2 different languages, basically.
Sure. That's exactly what you just described, is exactly what we do in those situations with our kids. Not necessarily when we're in it, but if we're in a class and describing it, it's not, well, what do you think? People will often tell me what they think about what's happening with the conflict with their kids. And I will exactly come back with those kinds of questions. We're not doing therapy, but it really is important to know, notice happening right now. When that's going on, what are you noticing? What are you noticing in your body? When you brought up sensations.
Yes.
It's so important. No one ever talks about that. It's with so me important. As a child, for sure. But like that the sensation of my body actually were doing something. Like that was my nervous system giving me signals.
It's how we build self-trust, is our awareness of that, right? And if you had asked me as a new parent, like, what's going on? I would have been like, well, my son is blah, 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 blah. But if you had asked me a different question, Ingrid, what are you experiencing right now? I would have broke down bawling, and I would have said, I'm so terrified.
It's just so different.
Those are different universes.
Yeah. Different framework, different perspective. Yeah. You're coming at it from a completely different, like, here's the lens going that way with the camera, and then we put it this way and shift completely.
Oh.
So look at it.
Nervous just thinking about it, but that's the answer, right? That's the pivot that's so important.
So how did you get from gaslighting yourself, telling yourself no, leaving home, going through these relationships, getting married, finding that one relationship that's finally going, and I love when you said, and I can't remember exactly how you put it, but this wasn't a relationship when you married your now husband. It wasn't like a wow, like, oh yes, I found it. It was very subtle and calm.
Yes.
And for people like us who've experienced trauma, that's kind of like, well, I don't know if that's going to be, if there's no, like, I'm good in a crisis. Like, I'm
Yes.
in my best self, right? Because
Yes.
there's something exciting happening that I can control or that I can go out and try to fix or control. But when that
Familiar. Yes.
normalcy comes
Yes.
in and it's
Mhm.
not familiar, we don't
Yeah.
recognize it, right? So how did you get from all of that chaos to then believing yourself, that believing that what you went through did impact you, was valid, and that you deserved differently? I'm sure that's kind of a big, long jump,
Well,
but what was that?
I think it points to a lot of things, which is that, first of all, it's a process. There's no magic one moment. I'm never going to give the like silver bullet, like, this is what I did on a Saturday at 3 and it unlocked everything, right? It's like, no, I got sober at 21 and I moved away from home and I started to build some of these other relationships. And I got married and it was a bad marriage. And quite frankly, the most helpful thing I did at that stage of my life is I was willing to get a divorce. I was willing to walk away for the first time ever to a relationship that I could finally see was not working, will not work. I can't wait for them to change any longer. I have to be the one to change and walk away. Like that alone,
Using that.
choosing me instead of feeling like it was my job just to constantly be there for them in the hopes that they're going to like grow up and sort of evolve, right? I just was like, not my job. I am my job. I'm going to go take care of me. So things like that along the way, I do think enabled me to meet my now husband, who is hands down the best relationship I've ever had. He's incredible. But the thing that I do think is relatable to what happened next, well, no, I have to say one more thing. My stepdad died. Okay. And I think this is important. It breaks my heart to say it on one hand, but I also want to let people off the hook that the body is in control of when it's ready and feels safe enough to heal. I do not know if he hadn't have died, if I ever would have felt safe enough to do it. And that's real. And I had no control over that. I could have gone to 87,000 trauma therapists, right? Like there is some truth to, I did not feel safe on this planet while he was still on it. So that happened. Okay. And then this is the thing that I find so interesting is that here I am a therapist and I have all these thoughts and modalities and books and trainings and workshops and blah, 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 blah. But what happened is my story that lived in my body started waking me up in the middle of the night to come right to where I'm sitting right here. And I had to type out these stories, these scenes from my life as though they had happened yesterday. It felt like they had happened yesterday because that's how they were living in my body. I could tell you what I was wearing, what it smelled like, the time of day, the exact dialogue. It was living in me as though it had happened yesterday. But it was stories, this one over here when I was 12 and then 16 and then my first marriage. And I was like, what is going on? I was possessed and I couldn't stop. And it was years of this, of me going, I am truly not well. Like every free moment, I'm grabbing my phone and dictating pieces of my story as I'm walking into the grocery store. It was like that until one day I could finally look down at these hundreds of pages that I'd written. And I had enough distance from them now because they weren't in me, they were on the page. And I could see my own story from a trauma therapist's eyes. And I could finally say, this is what this is. My stepfather was a narcissist. I have unresolved complex PTSD. This is what this is. And it freed me. And what I love about this is that I didn't decide one day, like, I'm going to go on a healing journey, right? Like my body decided. And it did it in this way I couldn't have planned in advance. I didn't even know what it was. And so to me, I go, the body wants to heal, and it is so genius. The body is so genius. Like, it will find a way. And this was the way that my body found me. And I was listening. And I encourage people to listen to the callings, to notice the nudges. Where does your interest like spark? Like, it matters so much. It matters so much.
Thank you for giving giving permission to all of us to use our voice, to write our stories. Because even if we're not going to publish a memoir, what you're saying about writing that, I know that I have done a lot of that. And it's like a compulsion to just, like you're saying, maybe it is to get it out and have distance to look at it. I'm not necessarily looking at it from the therapist, but I have to tell, through those eyes, but I have to tell you that when people like you share those stories and your professional perspective to be able to give validity.
Yes.
Like me, who thought, like, I've realized, like you said, like, whoa, that was abusive. Like, my life was still unraveling, and just to give voice to it somehow, whether we're sitting with a trusted friend that's listening and not maybe not saying anything, or a therapist. I just want to thank you for giving for just validating these stories. It just really, I just know that you're doing such incredible work by sharing your story, because you're helping people like me and others go, oh, okay, what I experienced wasn't normal. It wasn't okay.
It wasn't okay. It was traumatic. It did literally change foundationally, who we were, how we saw ourselves, all of our relational
informed all of my choices, all of my decisions, my relationships, all of those things. And those things that and I'm just speaking for myself, everybody else can choose them, but for me, I know that I can see how like you were saying, I can see how I chose relationships to kind of recreate what I knew would keep me safe. It wasn't because anything else was too risky. Not
way too risky. Yes, of course.
Yeah, it wasn't conscious, right? No. So it wasn't. And I love your humor. Everybody go to Ingrid's Instagram, because you're fun. When you post your funny posts about trauma, they're just so right on, and you're like, is that not me? And then, or sometimes you're just laughing along with you because they're so hilarious. I mean, we have to make light of it. I lost my train of thought because I don't know where I was going with that.
That's okay. Yeah. But I think this is a fair point too, that this is a part of the healing is community, right? Because there's connection. It's like, oh, you think this is funny too, because it's funny because it's true, right? We just go, oh, okay, we're in it together. And that we can laugh. And I love that. There's a lot of downsides to social media, but I have found, I've met some of the most incredible people this way, and real, authentic connections. And like, there are a lot of people out here fighting for their lives and fighting for their families' lives, and they're the bravest, most amazing, smartest, best people out there. And I love that we get to connect in that way.
It's amazing. I'm so glad that I stumbled upon that podcast that day and found you. Everybody run out and get her book, Believing Me, Healing from Narcissistic Abuse and Complex Trauma. Ingrid, thank you so much for joining me. I don't know, I'm sure that I will have another million questions. Maybe one day you'll come back and we can do this again. And
I'd be happy to. It was such a lovely conversation. Thank you for the work that you're doing. I really enjoyed this in getting to bring in more of the parenting piece, because I think it's such an important part of it. So thanks for having me on.
Oh, absolutely. And like you, I was not really running towards healing at all. And my daughter was a surprise. And it was sort of like, I wanted to know how to help people not basically be a-holes to children. And I remember, and I had started Teach Through Love before I was never going to have children.
Wow.
And I remember being like, my aunt going, what do I do with this? I was making like pamphlets of verbal abuse and what it can do. And I didn't know what I was doing. And then the universe was like, you can have a baby and do it through that. So I stumbled into this world myself, and it was what catapulted me to healing as well. So when you say follow those signs, listen, and just yes, everybody, no matter where you are, what you're doing, just listen to your body, find good people, and yeah. So I just love everything that you talk about. It's just wonderful. So thank you again. And I hope that we can do this.
I can't wait. Thank you.
Thank you, Ingrid.
Have a good rest of the day.
You too. Bye-bye.
Bye.